Some places are abandoned for a reason. Others simply wait for the one heart brave enough to listen. The morning begins like hundreds before it. A blanket of silver fog hangs low over the pine-covered hills outside Phillipsburg, Montana, where every tree seems to disappear into the pale silence beyond a few dozen yards. Michael Hayes, a 44-year-old white American veteran, steps onto the narrow forest trail with the familiar rhythm that has carried him through countless lonely mornings since leaving the Marine Corps. His olive field jacket is zipped against the crisp mountain air, and a faded canvas backpack rests comfortably across his shoulders. Beside him walks Ranger, a 6-year-old German shepherd whose sable coat glistens with tiny drops of dew collected from the tall grass. The shepherd moves with quiet confidence, ears forward, amber eyes scanning the forest with the calm awareness that only years of training and trust can create. Michael has long stopped wondering why these walks ease the weight he carries inside. Ever since his wife, Claire, passed away 3 years earlier after a long illness, silence has become both his companion and his refuge. The mountains never ask difficult questions. They simply allow a man to breathe. Ranger has learned that lesson too. He never pulls against the leash because there is no leash. He never wanders far because he never needs to. Every few moments he glances back toward Michael, making certain they are still walking together, just as they always have. The scent of damp pine, fresh earth, and cold stone fills the air, while distant ravens call somewhere beyond the thick forest canopy. Small streams hidden beneath moss-covered rocks whisper softly beneath the morning stillness. It is an ordinary day, until it is not. Ranger suddenly stops. His entire body becomes perfectly still. His ears lift higher. His nose points toward a wall of fog that blankets the hillside to their right. Michael notices the change immediately. During their years together, Ranger has frozen like this only a handful of times, each moment preceding something his own eyes could not yet see. Michael watches quietly. "What is it, partner?" he asks in a calm voice. Ranger does not bark. He does not growl. Instead, he slowly steps off the marked trail and disappears into the white mist without hesitation. Michael blinks in surprise. Ranger has never ignored the familiar route before. For several seconds, he considers calling the shepherd back, but something deep inside tells him not to break the silence. Instead, he follows. Wet branches brush against his jacket as he pushes through dense undergrowth. The forest grows strangely quiet. Even the birds seem to vanish. The fog thickens until only the faint outline of Ranger's broad shoulders remains visible several yards ahead. The ground beneath Michael's boots changes from packed soil to loose gravel scattered with rust-colored stones. A faint metallic scent begins to drift through the cool air, mixing with damp earth in a way that feels oddly unfamiliar. Ranger slows, but never hesitates. He walks as though he already knows exactly where he is going. Then the fog begins to lift. Massive timbers emerge first, dark and weathered by decades of forgotten seasons. Next comes a length of twisted railroad track disappearing into darkness. Finally, standing silently beneath the shadow of the mountain, an enormous abandoned mine in trance reveals itself, framed by cracked beams and faded warning signs nearly erased by time. Michael's heartbeat slows rather than quickens. He has lived in this part of Montana for years and studied nearly every trail map the county ever published, yet he has never heard anyone mention an abandoned mine in these woods. Ranger walks to the edge of the entrance and stops. The German shepherd stares into the darkness without fear, his tail perfectly still, his amber eyes reflecting the dim light filtering through the morning fog. Then, from somewhere deep inside the forgotten tunnel, a single distant sound echoes softly through the mountain, not loud enough to frighten, not clear enough to explain, but just enough to make Michael realize that whatever had drawn Ranger here had been waiting long before either of them ever arrived. Michael remained at the mouth of the abandoned mine, listening as the faint echo dissolved into silence so complete that he could hear the slow rhythm of his own breathing. Ranger never looked away from the darkness ahead. His ears stayed upright, his body relaxed yet focused, as though he recognized something hidden beyond the reach of ordinary sight. Michael had trusted that posture more times than he could count during their years together. Ranger never reacted without reason. If the shepherd believed there was something inside the forgotten tunnel, Michael knew there was little value in pretending otherwise. He reached into his backpack and removed a compact flashlight, checking the batteries before sweeping the narrow beam across the weathered entrance. Massive wooden support beams leaned slightly with age, but they remained surprisingly solid. Rusted mining rails disappeared into the darkness beneath a ceiling of rough stone where tiny drops of water fell with slow, patient rhythm. The air flowing from the tunnel felt noticeably cooler than the mountain breeze outside, carrying the scent of damp earth, old timber, iron, and mineral-rich rock untouched by sunlight for decades. Michael stepped forward carefully. Loose gravel shifted beneath his boots with soft crunching sounds that echoed gently through the passage. Ranger entered first without hesitation, moving several yards ahead before pausing to make certain Michael followed. The flashlight beam revealed abandoned mining carts resting beside the tracks, their wooden frames softened by time, but still standing where workers had left them generations earlier. Thick strands of cobwebs stretched between rusted tools hanging silently from the walls. Everything suggested the mine had remained undisturbed for many years. Yet something felt strangely different. There was no overwhelming sense of neglect. Instead, the tunnel carried an unexpected calm, almost like an old building patiently waiting for visitors rather than resisting them. Michael noticed his breathing slow as they walked deeper. The steady drip of water echoed through the stone corridors while tiny crystals embedded in the rock reflected faint points of light, like distant stars. Ranger suddenly stopped beside a weathered wooden post that supported one section of the ceiling. The German shepherd lowered his nose toward the ground, sniffed quietly, then looked back toward Michael before continuing. Curious, Michael aimed the flashlight downward. Mixed among decades of dust lay several footprints. They were faint and incomplete, nearly erased by time, but unmistakably human. He crouched for a closer look. The impressions were old enough that sharp edges had long disappeared, yet they seemed oddly preserved beneath the layer of fine mineral dust covering the tunnel floor. Michael stood again, quietly puzzled. Someone came through here long after the mine closed, he murmured. Ranger continued walking, leading him away from the main rail line toward a narrow side passage partially hidden behind fallen support beams. The opening looked barely wide enough for one person at a time. Michael squeezed through carefully, brushing aside hanging strands of moss that somehow survived in the cool, damp air. Beyond the narrow gap, the tunnel widened into a natural chamber untouched by machinery. The rough stone walls curved gracefully overhead, their surfaces glistening with moisture collected over countless seasons. At the center of the chamber stood an old iron lantern resting neatly upon a flat rock. Michael approached cautiously. He expected thick rust and decay, yet the lantern appeared remarkably well preserved. Beside it rested a small leather pouch, darkened with age. Ranger sat quietly beside the stone without touching either object, his amber eyes fixed on Michael with patient expectation. Michael knelt slowly and reached toward the pouch. The leather felt dry but intact beneath his fingertips. Carefully loosening the worn drawstring, he tipped the contents into his palm. A small brass compass slid gently into the light. Its glass remained unbroken despite the passing years. Michael watched as the needle spun once, then twice, before settling in a direction that did not point toward the tunnel entrance behind them. Instead, it pointed deeper into the mountain where no visible passage seemed to exist at all. Michael held the brass compass beneath the narrow beam of his flashlight, watching the needle remain perfectly steady as it pointed toward a solid wall of stone where no visible passage should have existed. He slowly turned in a full circle, expecting the compass to correct itself, but the needle refused to move. It continued pointing toward the same section of rough granite, as though something beyond the rock quietly called to it. Ranger stood beside the wall with calm patience, his nose lifted slightly into the cool air. The German shepherd did not scratch or bark. He simply watched Michael with the same unwavering confidence that had led them safely through countless miles of wilderness. Michael slipped the compass carefully into his jacket pocket before stepping closer to examine the stone surface. The flashlight revealed subtle differences he had overlooked from a distance. One section of the wall appeared smoother than the surrounding rock, its edges almost perfectly straight beneath years of mineral deposits. Thin veins of quartz shimmered faintly across the surface, while moisture gathered into tiny droplets that reflected the light like scattered stars. He ran one gloved hand across the cool granite and paused. The sound beneath his fingertips changed almost imperceptibly. Most of the wall answered with the dense silence of solid stone, but one narrow section produced a softer, hollow echo. Michael frowned. He had no experience as a miner, yet years of military service had taught him to notice details that others often ignored. Ranger slowly walked forward until his shoulder rested lightly against the smoother section of rock. The shepherd turned his head and gently nudged the stone once with his nose before stepping back. It was not a forceful push. It felt more like a quiet reminder. Michael searched the edges carefully until his fingers brushed against a rusted iron ring almost completely hidden beneath layers of mineral buildup. He wrapped both hands around the cold metal and pulled gently. At first nothing happened. Then, with a deep grinding sound softened by decades of dust, the stone panel shifted inward only a few inches before sliding slowly aside. Cool air drifted from the hidden opening, carrying a faint scent unlike anything they had encountered so far. It smelled of aged paper, cedar wood, and old lamp oil instead of damp earth. Michael stared silently into the narrow passage revealed behind the concealed doorway. "Someone built this," he whispered. Ranger entered first, his footsteps almost soundless against the smooth stone floor. Michael followed, sweeping the flashlight ahead. The hidden corridor stretched only about 30 feet before opening into a small chamber carved neatly into the mountain. Unlike the abandoned mine outside, this room showed unmistakable signs of deliberate care. Dust rested evenly across wooden shelves fastened to the walls. An old metal lantern hung from a ceiling hook. A sturdy oak table stood in the center of the room with two wooden chairs positioned opposite one another as though their occupants had simply stepped away for a moment. On the table rested a neatly folded wool blanket, a leather-bound journal, and a framed black-and-white photograph protected beneath surprisingly clear glass. Michael lifted the photograph carefully. Four Marines stood shoulder to shoulder outside a mountain facility, each accompanied by a German shepherd. Their expressions carried quiet confidence rather than pride. Behind them, partially visible above the entrance of a weathered structure, appeared a faded wooden sign. Michael leaned closer until the flashlight illuminated the weathered lettering. Blackstone Mine Rescue Unit. Ranger quietly approached the table and lowered his head beside the leather journal without touching it. Michael gently opened the cover. Inside the first page, written in steady blue ink untouched by haste, appeared a single sentence that immediately sent a quiet chill through his heart. "If a faithful shepherd has brought you here, then you have arrived exactly when you were meant to." Michael read the sentence twice before slowly lowering the journal onto the oak table. The neat handwriting carried neither urgency nor fear. Instead, it held the quiet confidence of someone who believed every word would eventually find the right reader. Ranger remained beside the table, his amber eyes following Michael with calm patience. The German shepherd had stopped, searching the room. It was as though he had already found exactly what he came for. Michael glanced around the hidden chamber once more. Every object rested in perfect order. Dust covered the shelves evenly, yet nothing appeared abandoned in the ordinary sense. It felt preserved rather than forgotten. Carefully, he opened the journal to the next page. The first entry was dated October 14th, 1978. It belonged to Captain Samuel Whitaker, United States Marine Corps. Michael settled into one of the old wooden chairs, the flashlight resting upright on the table, casting a warm circle of light across the fading ink. Captain Whitaker described how a small Marine rescue unit had been assigned to assist local mining communities during emergencies throughout western Montana. Their mission was simple. Whenever cave-ins, flooding, or dangerous conditions trapped civilians beyond the reach of ordinary rescue teams, specially trained Marines and German shepherds entered first. The captain never described the dogs as equipment. He referred to them as fellow rescuers who possessed instincts no machine could ever replace. Michael smiled quietly. He had known handlers who spoke exactly the same way. Ranger lowered himself onto the stone floor beside Michael's boots, listening as though the familiar rhythm of turning pages carried meaning beyond the written words. Several entries described long nights beneath the mountain, lantern light reflecting from wet stone walls, while faithful German shepherds located frightened miners hidden beyond collapsed tunnels. Captain Whitaker repeatedly credited the dogs before mentioning himself, or any Marine. One sentence caught Michael's attention immediately. The shepherd always finds the path before the man understands why it exists. Michael looked instinctively toward Ranger. The words felt less like history and more like a description of the journey they were living at that very moment. He continued reading. Winter storms, rescue drills, quiet evenings spent maintaining equipment, handwritten notes about the personalities of each working dog. Every page carried respect instead of glory. Then the journal introduced one name more often than any other. Hope. Captain Whitaker described Hope as a German shepherd whose calm determination often led the team toward survivors before any sound or visible clue suggested someone remained inside the mountain. The captain never claimed the dog possessed supernatural abilities. He simply admitted that experience had taught him to trust Hope without hesitation. Michael reached down and gently rested his hand against Ranger's broad neck. The shepherd leaned into the familiar touch before quietly lifting his head toward the far corner of the chamber. Michael followed his gaze. Resting alone upon a narrow wooden shelf stood an old leather collar beside a carefully polished brass nameplate. Curious, he approached slowly. The collar had been preserved with remarkable care, its stitching still strong despite the passing decades. The brass plate beneath it reflected the flashlight beam just brightly enough to reveal a single engraved word. Hope. Beside the display rested another small photograph. It showed Captain Whitaker kneeling beside a sable-coated German shepherd whose intelligent amber eyes looked almost identical to Ranger's. Michael felt an unexpected warmth settle across his chest. He was no longer simply reading forgotten history. He was standing inside it. As he carefully returned the photograph to its place, Ranger walked toward the back wall where an old wooden cabinet stood beneath a faded American flag. The German shepherd stopped without making a sound, his nose resting lightly against one closed drawer. Michael stepped beside him and gently pulled the worn brass handle. Inside rested dozens of neatly tied envelopes, each sealed but addressed to someone who had never received them. Michael stood silently before the open drawer, allowing his flashlight to move slowly across the neatly arranged envelopes. Every bundle was tied with faded blue ribbon, every address written by the same careful hand that filled Captain Samuel Whitaker's journal. Dust rested lightly upon the cabinet, yet the paper itself remained remarkably well preserved, protected from moisture by the cool, dry air hidden deep inside the mountain. Ranger remained beside him without touching a single envelope. The German shepherd simply watched with quiet patience, as though he already understood these letters deserved to be opened gently, one story at a time. Michael reached for the first bundle and loosened the ribbon with careful fingers. The top envelope was addressed to Mrs. Eleanor Brooks, Helena, Montana. Another carried the name of a retired firefighter in Butte. A third was addressed to the family of a volunteer miner in Missoula. Every envelope bore a different destination, yet none showed a postage stamp or mailing date. It was as though someone had written each message with complete intention, but never found the right moment to send them. Michael selected the first letter and unfolded the yellowed pages with great care. Captain Whitaker's handwriting greeted him once again. The letter thanked Mrs. Brooks for allowing her son to serve beside the Marine rescue team during one of the harshest winters Montana had ever seen. It described not heroic victories, but ordinary acts of kindness. A young volunteer, sharing his last thermos of coffee with exhausted rescuers. A German shepherd resting quietly beside frightened miners until daylight arrived. Marines carrying supplies without expecting recognition. The final sentence lingered in Michael's thoughts. The mountain remembers every generous heart, even when history forgets the names. Michael folded the letter slowly. There was nothing dramatic within its pages. No secret military operation. No hidden treasure. Only gratitude preserved with extraordinary care. He opened another envelope. This one thanked the parents of a local schoolteacher who had spent weekends helping rescue dogs become comfortable around frightened children after emergencies. Another letter expressed appreciation to a small church whose volunteers prepared warm meals whenever rescue teams returned from long operations beneath the mountain. One after another, the letters painted a quiet portrait of a community built not upon fame, but upon ordinary people choosing compassion again and again. Ranger suddenly stood and walked toward a second shelf beside the cabinet. Resting there was a weathered wooden box no larger than a lunch pail. Michael lifted the lid. Inside lay several marine dog tags, carefully wrapped in clean linen, alongside polished service medals and handwritten name cards identifying each owner. Nothing appeared forgotten. Everything had been lovingly organized for the day someone might finally return. Beneath the medals rested a folded map of the mine drawn entirely by hand. Faded pencil lines marked tunnels, rescue stations, emergency exits, and supply rooms. One section, near the deepest part of the mountain, had been circled repeatedly. Beside it, Captain Whitaker had written only 4 words. Hope always stopped here. Michael spread the map carefully across the oak table. Ranger approached immediately and lowered his nose onto the exact location marked by the captain nearly 50 years earlier. The German shepherd remained perfectly still. Michael looked from the map to the faithful dog beside him. A quiet smile crossed his face. You already know where it is, do not you? Ranger lifted his head and calmly walked toward another narrow passage extending beyond the hidden chamber, disappearing into darkness untouched by the flashlight's beam. Before following, Michael folded the map carefully and slipped it inside his jacket beside the brass compass. The 2 objects now rested together against his chest, one pointing silently forward, the other revealing where the journey still needed to lead. Michael slipped the folded map securely into his jacket beside the brass compass and followed Ranger into the narrow passage beyond the hidden chamber. The tunnel was noticeably different from the abandoned mine they had entered earlier. Here the floor had been carefully leveled, and the walls bore faint chisel marks that suggested deliberate construction rather than natural excavation. The air felt still, carrying the subtle scent of cedar wood mixed with cool stone instead of damp decay. Ranger moved at an unhurried pace, never more than a few yards ahead, occasionally glancing back to make certain Michael remained close. The flashlight beam swept across the walls, revealing old metal brackets where lanterns had once been mounted at regular intervals. Every detail spoke of careful planning. Whoever built this passage had intended it to be used often, not hidden forever. After several minutes, the corridor widened into another chamber where the ceiling rose nearly 20 feet overhead. Massive stone pillars supported the mountain with quiet strength, their surfaces shimmering with tiny crystals that reflected the flashlight in thousands of scattered points of light. Along one wall stood several sturdy wooden cabinets, each labeled with neatly painted lettering that remained surprisingly readable despite the passing decades. Medical supplies, rescue equipment, emergency rations. Michael approached the nearest cabinet and gently opened its door. Inside, shelves held carefully organized supplies that had long exceeded their useful life. Yet everything remained arranged with remarkable discipline. Folded blankets, empty first aid tins, weathered ropes, and neatly coiled climbing lines rested exactly where someone had placed them many years ago. Nothing had been scattered or abandoned in panic. It felt as though the entire rescue station had simply closed at the end of an ordinary shift. Ranger crossed the chamber toward a rough stone wall where an old wooden bench rested beneath a faded American flag carefully folded inside a glass display case. The shepherd stopped before the bench and lowered his head. Michael joined him quietly. Resting on the seat was another leather-bound journal, smaller than Captain Whitaker's, but equally well-preserved. A simple brass plate fastened to its cover carried 2 engraved words. Field Notes. Michael opened it carefully. Unlike the captain's journal, these pages contained short daily observations written by different members of the rescue team. One entry described a successful search made possible because Hope refused to leave a narrow tunnel until everyone followed. Another praised a volunteer who spent hours calming frightened children while the dogs worked nearby. Every page reflected the same quiet truth. The mission had never been about recognition. It had always been about bringing people safely home. Near the final pages, Michael noticed one entry written in noticeably different handwriting. It was signed only with the initials C.W. The words were brief. If Hope ever leads another shepherd here, trust the place where he chooses to stop. Michael slowly closed the journal and looked toward Ranger. At that exact moment, the German shepherd walked away from the bench and approached the far side of the chamber where a large section of smooth granite rose from floor to ceiling. He sat directly in front of it without making a sound. Michael removed the folded map once more and compared the hand-drawn markings with the room around him. The circled location matched perfectly. Hope always stopped here. He rested one hand against the cool stone. It appeared completely solid until his fingertips brushed across a narrow groove, almost invisible beneath years of mineral deposits. Following the groove downward, he discovered a small bronze handle recessed into the rock. He pulled gently. Somewhere beyond the wall, hidden gears stirred with a deep, patient rumble. Slowly, a section of granite shifted aside, revealing a softly illuminated chamber unlike anything Michael had expected. Warm sunlight streamed through a narrow opening high above, falling directly onto a polished wooden memorial where several framed photographs, marine dog tags, and one beautifully preserved German Shepherd collar rested together in complete silence, as though the mountain itself had guarded them until this very day. Michael stepped into the hidden memorial chamber with quiet reverence, his boots making almost no sound upon the smooth stone floor. The space felt remarkably different from every tunnel they had passed through. The cool dampness of the abandoned mine gave way to air that was dry, still, and faintly scented with cedar and old paper. Above, a narrow shaft opened toward the mountainside, allowing a single beam of afternoon sunlight to fall directly onto the polished wooden memorial at the center of the room. Dust drifted lazily through the golden light like tiny floating stars. Ranger entered beside him without hesitation, yet the German Shepherd immediately slowed his pace. His ears relaxed. His breathing became calm. He approached the memorial with the quiet dignity of a visitor returning to a familiar place rather than discovering it for the first time. Michael watched in silence as the shepherd stopped before the carefully preserved collar resting upon a folded piece of dark blue cloth. The collar was made from worn brown leather, its brass buckle polished despite the passing decades. Attached to it hung a small engraved plate bearing a single name, Hope. Michael knelt beside Ranger and gently lifted the collar into his hands. The leather remained surprisingly supple, preserved with extraordinary care. He turned it over slowly and discovered another engraving hidden along the inside. Faithfulness outlives time. Those 3 words lingered in the quiet chamber long after he whispered them aloud. Ranger leaned forward and lightly touched the collar with his nose before sitting once more. His amber eyes never left the memorial. Michael carefully returned the collar to its place and noticed several framed photographs arranged behind it. One showed Captain Samuel Whitaker kneeling beside Hope outside the entrance to Blackstone Mine, while several Marines stood smiling behind them. Another captured rescue volunteers gathered around a campfire after a successful operation, their tired faces illuminated by warm lantern light rather than celebration. Every image reflected simple gratitude instead of heroism. Resting beside the photographs lay a neatly folded American flag beneath a sheet of protective glass. Beside it stood a wooden plaque carved by hand. Michael stepped closer to read the inscription, dedicated to those who entered the mountain so others could return home. May loyalty always lead where fear cannot. Michael lowered his head for several quiet seconds. The words reminded him of countless Marines he had served beside, ordinary people who rarely considered themselves extraordinary despite the difference they made in countless lives. He understood now why this place had been hidden. It was never built to impress visitors. It existed to preserve gratitude without asking for recognition. Ranger quietly walked toward a narrow wooden stand positioned beside the memorial. Resting upon it was a single sealed envelope tied with faded blue ribbon. Unlike the letters stored in the cabinet outside, this envelope carried no address. Across the front someone had written only 6 words. For the one who followed the shepherd. Michael gently untied the ribbon and unfolded the carefully preserved pages inside. The familiar handwriting of Captain Whitaker greeted him once again. The captain explained that every rescue team eventually comes to understand one simple truth. The dogs often recognized hope long before people could see it for themselves. They did not lead because they were ordered to. They led because trust had become part of who they were. Michael paused, his eyes drifting toward Ranger, who remained quietly seated beside the memorial. He thought about every morning walk since Claire's passing, every silent mile through forests where words had never been necessary. Without realizing it, Ranger had guided him long before today. As Michael folded the letter closed, a soft breeze drifted through the narrow opening above, gently stirring the faded blue ribbon. Somewhere beyond the hidden chamber, carried faintly through the winding tunnels of the mountain, came the quiet sound of an old brass bell ringing only once before the silence returned. Michael stood motionless for several long seconds after the quiet bell faded into silence. The sound had been soft, almost delicate, yet it lingered inside the hidden chamber far longer than any echo should have survived. Ranger did not react with surprise. The German shepherd simply lifted his head toward the narrow opening high above where sunlight continued to pour into the memorial room, his calm expression unchanged, as though the gentle chime belonged naturally to this forgotten place. Michael carefully folded Captain Whitaker's letter and returned it to the envelope before placing it exactly where he had found it. Some things deserved to remain part of the mountain until the next faithful visitor arrived. He glanced once more across the memorial. The polished collar, the photographs, the folded flag, and the handwritten plaque no longer felt like relics trapped in history. They felt like living reminders that quiet service often outlasted. Applause. Rangers slowly walked toward the far side of the chamber, where another small wooden pedestal stood beneath the beam of sunlight. Resting upon it was a single leather portfolio secured with a brass clasp. Unlike the journals and letters, this case bore no dust at all. Michael hesitated before opening it, almost expecting someone to quietly object. The chamber remained completely still. He released the clasp and unfolded the worn leather cover. Inside rested one final document protected beneath clear archival paper. Across the top appeared an official heading from the United States Marine Corps, followed by the words "Final Field Report." Michael settled onto one knee beside Ranger and began reading. Captain Whitaker explained that after years of rescue operations, the Blackstone Mine Rescue Unit would officially close when safer mining practices reduced the need for emergency deployments. Every member of the team had been reassigned. Every piece of equipment had been accounted for. Yet one request remained. The captain asked that the memorial chamber never become a public attraction. Instead, it should remain untouched until another Marine arrived through the guidance of a faithful German shepherd. He admitted that the request sounded unusual, but he believed some places revealed themselves only when people came searching with gratitude instead of curiosity. Michael quietly smiled. The words reflected everything he had experienced since following Ranger into the mountain. There had been no dramatic discoveries, no hidden fortune, no impossible miracle waiting inside the darkness. What he found instead was something infinitely more valuable. A lifetime of ordinary courage preserved by people who never expected history to remember them. Ranger gently rested his head against Michael's shoulder, and for the first time since entering the mine, Michael felt the familiar ache left by Claire's passing soften in a way he could never explain. He realized she would have loved this place. She had always believed kindness left invisible footprints long after people disappeared. Carefully closing the portfolio, Michael noticed one final object resting beneath it. It was a small brass key attached to a weathered wooden tag engraved with 3 simple words: Veterans Heritage Museum. Michael turned the key slowly between his fingers while reading the short handwritten note tucked beneath it. If these stories are ever found, let them return to the people they were always meant to encourage. Preserve the truth. Share the gratitude. Protect the names. Michael slipped the key into his jacket beside the compass and folded map. He understood now that his journey through the mountain had never been about discovering a secret. It had been about accepting a responsibility. Ranger quietly stood and walked toward the hidden stone doorway. This time, before leaving the chamber, the German shepherd paused and looked back one last time at Hope's collar resting beneath the warm sunlight. Michael followed his gaze, nodded silently in respect, and together they stepped back into the quiet passage, carrying with them not treasures hidden beneath stone, but a legacy waiting to be brought into the light. Michael and Ranger retraced their steps through the hidden passage without speaking, the silence between them feeling fuller than any conversation could have been. The folded map rested inside Michael's jacket beside the brass compass and the small museum key, each object carrying a purpose that had become clearer with every step beneath the mountain. The flashlight cast long beams across the carefully carved corridor, while tiny droplets of water shimmered on the stone walls like scattered pieces of morning light. Ranger maintained his steady pace, never hurrying, never wandering, occasionally glancing back with the same calm confidence that had guided Michael since the moment they left the familiar forest trail. When they reached the rescue chamber once more, Michael paused before the wooden cabinets lined neatly against the wall. He looked across the folded blankets, weathered ropes, first aid tins, and carefully organized equipment. Everything remained exactly as it had been left decades earlier. He quietly understood that not everything belonged inside a museum. Some places deserved to remain untouched, preserving their own quiet dignity. The journals, letters, photographs, and official reports would help future generations remember, but the chambers themselves belonged to the mountain that had protected them for so many years. Ranger stopped beside the oak table where Captain Samuel Whitaker's journal still rested beneath the warm circle of flashlight light. Michael gently closed the leather cover and placed it exactly where he had found it. Beside it, he left the brass compass. He smiled softly as he watched the needle settle one final time toward the hidden memorial beyond the wall. It had completed its purpose. The mountain no longer needed to point anyone forward. Michael quietly whispered, "Thank you." Ranger lowered his head briefly before turning toward the concealed doorway leading back into the abandoned mine. Together they passed through the narrow opening as the hidden stone panel slowly returned to its original position behind them with a deep, gentle rumble that echoed through the passage before fading into silence. The abandoned mine felt different now. The darkness no longer seemed mysterious. Instead, it felt peaceful, as though the weight of forgotten years had quietly lifted. They followed the rusted rail tracks toward the entrance where pale afternoon sunlight waited beyond the weathered timbers. As they stepped outside, cool mountain air greeted them with the scent of pine, fresh grass, and distant rain carried across the valley. Michael took a slow breath and looked back toward the mine entrance. From the outside, nothing hinted at the remarkable history hidden beneath the mountain. The cracked support beams, faded warning signs, and twisted rails appeared exactly as they had that morning. Only he and Ranger knew what rested beyond the stone. His cellular telephone vibrated gently inside his pocket as reception finally returned. The screen displayed a missed message from Emily Foster, the curator of the Veterans Heritage Museum in Phillipsburg, someone Michael had met years earlier during a local remembrance ceremony. He listened quietly. Emily explained that the museum had recently begun searching for historical records connected to forgotten marine rescue teams that once assisted Montana mining communities. They had found scattered references to Blackstone Mine, but no surviving documentation. If Michael happened to know anyone with local knowledge, she hoped he might call. Michael slowly lowered the telephone and exchanged a quiet glance with Ranger. A gentle smile crossed his face. The timing no longer felt like coincidence. He reached into his jacket and touched the small brass key resting safely beside the folded map. Captain Whitaker's final request had found its moment. Michael looked once more toward the dark entrance of the abandoned mine, where soft afternoon shadows stretched across the weathered rails. Then, with Ranger walking faithfully at his side, he turned toward the forest trail, carrying not the weight of a remarkable discovery, but the quiet responsibility of making certain that ordinary courage, unwavering loyalty, and forgotten gratitude would finally find their way home. The following morning, Michael arrived at the Veterans Heritage Museum just after sunrise with Ranger walking quietly beside him across the brick pathway leading to the front entrance. The historic building stood beneath a canopy of tall cottonwood trees whose golden leaves drifted gently through the cool Montana air. It was a modest museum, built more for preserving memories than attracting crowds, and that simple purpose suddenly felt exactly right. Emily Foster greeted them at the front door with a warm smile. She was in her early 50s, dressed casually, carrying the quiet enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved forgotten history. Ranger approached politely, accepting her gentle greeting before sitting calmly beside Michael. Emily noticed the weathered brass key resting in Michael's hand almost immediately. Her expression shifted from curiosity to quiet surprise. "Where did you find that?" she asked softly. Michael smiled but did not answer immediately. Instead, he placed the folded map, Captain Samuel Whitaker's official field report, several carefully selected copies of letters, and the brass key upon a large wooden table inside the museum archives. Emily studied each item with growing amazement. She adjusted her reading glasses several times before looking back toward Michael. "These records were considered lost for nearly 50 years, she whispered. "We knew the rescue unit existed, but almost nothing survived beyond scattered newspaper articles and a few government references. Michael looked toward Ranger, who had quietly settled beside an old display case containing military photographs from previous generations. "They were never truly lost," he replied. "Someone simply trusted the mountain to protect them until the right time." Emily carefully unfolded Captain Whitaker's final field report. The room became completely silent except for the gentle ticking of an old wall clock. As she reached the final page, her eyes paused upon the request asking that the memorial remain undisturbed while the stories themselves returned to future generations. She lowered the document slowly. "We can honor that," she said with quiet certainty. "The location will remain private. Only the history will be shared." Michael nodded in agreement. That had been his hope from the beginning. Throughout the morning, they worked together preserving every document with archival sleeves and protective folders. Ranger remained close, calmly observing each movement with patient attention. Whenever Michael hesitated while recalling details from the hidden chambers, the German shepherd would quietly lift his head as though reminding him that every memory mattered. By early afternoon, Emily had already confirmed several names listed in the journals through military archives and county records. Every detail matched. Captain Samuel Whitaker had indeed commanded a specialized marine rescue unit assigned to support dangerous mining operations throughout western Montana during the late 1970s. Hope appeared repeatedly within official commendations, though only as a working dog identified by service number rather than by the extraordinary loyalty described throughout the journals. Emily smiled sadly. "History records achievements," she said. "The journals remembered hearts." Michael looked toward the museum windows where warm sunlight filled the room with gentle afternoon light. He realized that Claire would have appreciated Emily's words. She had often reminded him that people remembered how kindness felt long after they forgot dates and statistics. Before leaving, Emily unlocked a small wooden display cabinet reserved for newly acquired collections. Instead of placing medals or photographs inside first, she carefully positioned a framed copy of Captain Whitaker's handwritten sentence where every visitor would easily see it. "The shepherd always finds the path before the man understands why it exists." Michael stood quietly reading the words while Ranger rested beside him. Several visitors entering the museum paused before the display, reading the sentence with thoughtful expressions before continuing deeper into the exhibits. None of them knew the full story yet. None of them knew about the hidden chambers beneath the mountain. But Michael quietly realized they did not need every detail. Sometimes a single sentence carried enough truth to begin healing hearts that had been waiting far longer than anyone realized. Over the following weeks, the small Veterans Heritage Museum quietly became a place where forgotten memories found new voices. Emily carefully preserved every document Michael had entrusted to the archives while honoring Captain Whitaker's request that the hidden memorial remain known only to those who had already discovered it. Instead of announcing an extraordinary discovery, the museum created a modest exhibit celebrating the history of marine rescue teams and the remarkable partnership between handlers and their German shepherd companions. Visitors entered expecting military artifacts and photographs. Yet many found themselves lingering before the handwritten journal pages far longer than they expected. Ranger accompanied Michael nearly every Thursday morning when he volunteered at the museum. The German shepherd quickly became a familiar presence among veterans, schoolchildren, and families exploring the exhibits. Young children often knelt beside him, gently stroking his sable coat while asking questions about service dogs. Older veterans rarely spoke at first. Many simply stood beside Ranger in thoughtful silence before quietly sharing stories of dogs they had known during their own years of service. Michael listened more than he talked. He had spent years believing his own memories were too heavy to carry into conversations with strangers. Now he discovered that every story shared seemed to lighten another person's burden as well as his own. One afternoon, an elderly man entered the museum carrying a faded photograph inside a weathered envelope. His hands trembled slightly with age, yet his smile remained steady. He introduced himself as Thomas Whitaker, the youngest son of Captain Samuel Whitaker. Emily quietly invited him into the archive room where Michael was organizing copies of the journals. Thomas carefully unfolded the old photograph. It showed the same rescue team Michael had first seen inside the hidden chamber. Only this version captured the entire group standing outside Blackstone Mine, with Hope proudly seated in front. Tears gathered gently in the elderly man's eyes as he compared the photograph with the preserved journal pages resting on the table. "My father always said that history belonged to everyone who chose kindness," he whispered. "I never imagined someone would protect his words this long." Michael handed Thomas a carefully preserved copy of Captain Whitaker's final field report. The elderly man read every page without speaking. When he reached the final request asking that the mountain remain undisturbed, he quietly nodded. "That sounds exactly like him," he said. "He never cared about monuments. He cared about people remembering why they served." Ranger slowly approached Thomas and rested his head gently against the old man's knee. Thomas smiled through quiet tears and stroked the shepherd's neck with slow, grateful movements. "You remind me of Hope," he whispered. "The eyes are different, but the heart feels exactly the same." Michael watched the moment without interrupting. Somehow it seemed impossible that a simple gesture between an elderly stranger and a faithful dog could carry so much meaning, yet it did. Before leaving, Thomas presented the museum with a small cedar box that had remained in his family for decades. Inside rested several personal letters written by Captain Whitaker after the rescue unit officially closed. They contained no military secrets, only reflections about friendship, gratitude, and the quiet courage he witnessed every day beneath the mountain. Emily accepted the gift with deep appreciation, promising that the letters would remain together with the journals for future generations. As the afternoon sunlight streamed through the museum windows, Michael realized the hidden chambers beneath Blackstone Mine had already fulfilled their purpose. They had not preserved history simply to be discovered. They had preserved hope until someone was ready to carry it forward. Ranger walked beside him toward the front entrance as visitors continued moving quietly through the exhibits, each leaving with a little more gratitude than they had carried inside. Nearly 1 year passed before Michael found himself standing once again at the edge of the familiar forest where everything had quietly begun. Autumn had returned to the Montana mountains, painting the hillsides with deep gold, crimson, and amber. Ranger walked a few steps ahead along the narrow trail with the same calm confidence he had shown on that unforgettable morning, though there was no urgency in his movements this time. They were not searching for answers. They were simply returning with grateful hearts. Michael carried only a small canvas pack over one shoulder. Inside rested a fresh bundle of white wildflowers, a clean notebook, and one carefully handwritten letter. Nothing else. As they reached the place where the abandoned mine entrance had first revealed itself through the fog, Michael stopped. The mountain looked unchanged beneath the soft afternoon sunlight. Tall pines swayed gently in the breeze. Birds moved freely between the branches, and the scent of cedar filled the crisp air. Yet the opening to the mine was nowhere to be seen. Michael stepped slowly through the undergrowth, searching for the weathered beams, the rusted rails, and the faded warning signs he remembered so clearly. There was only untouched forest. Moss covered the rocks. Ferns stretched across the hillside. No trail led forward. No footprints disturbed the earth. Ranger quietly approached the same place where the entrance should have stood and calmly sat upon the grass. He looked toward the hillside for several peaceful moments before turning his attention back to Michael. There was no confusion in his eyes, only quiet understanding. Michael smiled softly. Somehow he had expected this. He reached into his canvas pack and removed the folded letter. Kneeling beside Ranger, he rested the paper beneath a flat stone surrounded by wildflowers growing naturally between the roots of an old pine tree. The letter contained only a few simple sentences. "Thank you for every life you guided safely home. Thank you for preserving kindness when no one was watching. Your stories continue walking beside us." Michael gently placed the white flowers beside the stone and stood once more. The breeze stirred the pine branches overhead, carrying the familiar scent of mountain air across the hillside. For just a brief moment, the distant sound of a single bell drifted softly through the forest before fading into silence. Michael closed his eyes, allowing the peaceful stillness to settle around him. He no longer wondered where the sound came from. Some mysteries did not need solving in order to be meaningful. Ranger rose quietly and walked toward the lakeshore trail instead of the hillside. Michael followed without hesitation. Along the way, they passed families enjoying the autumn afternoon, children skipping stones across the water, and hikers smiling as they admired the beautiful German shepherd walking faithfully beside his owner. No one recognized the extraordinary journey that had unfolded beneath the mountain months before. Michael found comfort in that. The greatest acts of loyalty often happened far from crowds, leaving only gentle changes inside the hearts they touched. As the sun slowly lowered behind the western ridges, warm golden light spread across Blackwood Lake until the water reflected the sky like polished glass. Michael paused at the shoreline and watched Ranger stand quietly beside the calm water, his sable coat glowing beneath the evening light. He realized that healing had never arrived all at once. It had come one faithful step at a time, guided not by certainty, but by trust. And standing there with his loyal companion beside him, he understood that while the hidden chambers beneath the mountain might never reveal themselves again, the quiet lessons they protected would continue leading both of them forward for the rest of their lives. The seasons continued to change, yet something inside Michael remained quietly transformed. Winter covered the Montana mountains with fresh snow, spring returned with rushing streams and bright wildflowers, and summer filled the forests with warm sunlight filtering through endless rows of pine trees. Through every season, Ranger remained faithfully at his side, just as he always had. Every Thursday morning, they visited the Veterans Heritage Museum, where new visitors paused before Captain Samuel Whitaker's words, reading them slowly before continuing through the exhibits with thoughtful expressions. Some arrived searching for military history. Others came because they loved German shepherds. Most left carrying something they had not expected. They carried a renewed belief that quiet acts of kindness never truly disappear. Michael no longer avoided conversations about his years in the Marine Corps. Instead, he spoke gently about friendship, responsibility, and the faithful companions who often carried burdens that words never could. He rarely mentioned the hidden chambers beneath the mountain. That story belonged to the place itself. Instead, he shared the lessons those chambers had protected for so many years. Children listened with wide eyes whenever Ranger calmly rested beside them during museum programs. Veterans smiled when they recognized the familiar loyalty shining inside the shepherd's amber eyes. Families often thanked Michael before leaving, explaining that they planned to spend more time together, volunteer in their communities, or simply appreciate the quiet people who served without asking for recognition. One cool September evening, after the museum had closed for the day, Emily handed Michael a small envelope before locking the front door. Inside rested a newspaper clipping announcing that the State Historical Society had officially recognized the Marine Rescue Unit for its extraordinary service to Montana mining communities. The article mentioned Captain Samuel Whitaker by name. It honored hope alongside every volunteer and Marine who had quietly protected lives beneath the mountain. There was no mention of the hidden memorial, no mention of the secret chambers. Michael smiled with quiet satisfaction. History had finally remembered the people. The mountain could keep the rest. As twilight settled across the valley, Michael and Ranger followed the familiar trail leading toward Blackwood Lake. The water reflected a sky painted with soft shades of gold, lavender, and deep blue, while gentle ripples carried the last light of day across the peaceful shoreline. Ranger paused beside the lake exactly where he had first stopped on the morning that changed everything. This time he did not look toward the forest. He looked toward Michael. The veteran knelt beside his faithful companion and rested both hands gently against the shepherd's broad shoulders. "You never simply showed me a hidden place," he whispered with a grateful smile. "You showed me how to keep walking after I believed my journey was over." Ranger leaned forward and gently touched his nose against Michael's hand before sitting quietly beside him once more. Neither of them needed another destination. The greatest journey had never been measured by miles beneath the mountain. It had been measured by every quiet choice to trust, to remember, to forgive, and to carry hope forward even after loss. The evening breeze moved softly across the lake, carrying the scent of pine, fresh water, and distant cedar through the cooling air. Somewhere far beyond the trees, a single bell seemed to ring one last gentle note before fading into the peaceful silence of the mountains. Michael smiled toward the horizon without searching for its source. Some gifts were never meant to be explained. They were simply meant to be lived. As darkness slowly settled across Blackwood Lake, the veteran and his faithful German shepherd turned together toward the quiet lights of home, their footsteps steady, their shadows side by side, and their hearts forever guided by the timeless truth. That loyalty never disappears, kindness never loses its way, and the smallest faithful companion can sometimes lead a weary soul to the greatest treasure of all.